In a time when the air was thick with the whispers of rebellion and conquest, a pivotal yet brief moment emerged, a flicker of justice amidst centuries of dispossession. Native Americans, for the first time in their tumultuous history with European colonizers, briefly reclaimed the right to their ancestral lands. This was not a mere coincidence but the result of a groundbreaking proclamation from King George III himself, a decree that sent shockwaves through the colonies and beyond. For a fleeting moment, Native American voices rose above the cacophony of European expansion, staking their claim to the lands that had been theirs for millennia. The bold decree that shocked the world, King George III's proclamation. It was in 1763, a year marked by seismic shifts in global power, that King George III made a decision that would change the course of Native American history. In a world where colonial powers had long treated indigenous peoples as obstacles to be swept aside, this decree was nothing short of revolutionary. For the first time, the colonial rulers of North America recognized the rights of Native Americans to their lands. A king, far removed from the blood-soaked soil of the Americas, issued a proclamation that halted the reckless seizure of native lands by colonists. No longer could settlers simply claim lands west of the Appalachian Mountains, nor could they buy these lands without the formal treaties that respected tribal sovereignty. This was a bold step, a radical departure from the past, where violence and theft were the primary tools of expansion. But like many great moments in history, this acknowledgement of Native American rights was laced with irony and tragedy. While King George's decree paved the way for the recognition of indigenous rights, it also inadvertently set the stage for their eventual downfall. In the years that followed, the loss of tribal lands would accelerate as British settlers and the rising American colonial population pushed ever further westward. A gathering of chiefs, the historic meeting at Fort Niagara. In the wake of this proclamation, something unprecedented happened. From far and wide, Native American chiefs and representatives from various tribes gathered for a historic meeting at Fort Niagara in what is now New York. The air was electric with hope, as over 2,000 Native Americans came to celebrate the proclamation, forging a fragile alliance with their old enemies, the British. They brought with them wampum belts, ancient symbols of peace, hoping for a future where their people could coexist with the British settlers in peace and mutual respect. Little did they know, this meeting, meant to cement their place in a new order, would ultimately become a stepping stone toward their dispossession. The proclamation, while acknowledging their rights, also came with caveats. It was never about justice for the sake of justice. It was about maintaining order and control in a rapidly expanding empire. The British sought to stabilize their frontier, not out of goodwill, but because they feared that continued conflict with Native Americans would destabilize their hold on the American colonies. The inevitable march toward loss, Pontiac's War and the betrayal of promises. Even as Native Americans celebrated at Fort Niagara, the seeds of their eventual betrayal were already being sown. On the other side of the frontier, tension boiled over. The proclamation, which aimed to keep settlers and Native Americans apart, was a bitter pill for many colonial settlers to swallow. They had fought in the French and Indian War, watched their homes burn, and lost family members to violence. Now, they were being told that they could not claim the land they had fought for. Anger and resentment festered in the hearts of frontier settlers. This tension exploded in the form of Pontiac's War. The Ottawa chief Pontiac, who had allied with the French, led a series of bloody uprisings against British settlements. The conflict became a symbol of Native American resistance to colonial encroachment, but it also marked the beginning of the end. The British, now weary of constant conflict, began to view Native Americans less as allies and more as obstacles to their growing empire. While Pontiac's War resulted in hundreds of British colonial deaths and the destruction of settlements, it ultimately failed to achieve a decisive victory for the indigenous tribes. This war ignited a fierce racial divide. White settlers viewed Native Americans with a new level of hostility and distrust, leading to a hardening of attitudes toward indigenous peoples. The British government, eager to maintain peace and order, issued proclamations that further isolated Native Americans from the settlers, attempting to create a buffer zone between the two. Yet, this only intensified tensions, as many colonists felt entitled to the lands the proclamation sought to protect. The bitter fruits of war, how the proclamation set the stage for the American Revolution. The Proclamation of 1763 was a spark in the powder keg of colonial discontent. While it was intended to prevent further bloodshed, it ended up stoking the flames of rebellion. Colonists, especially those who had already set their sights on the fertile lands west of the Appalachians, saw the proclamation as an intolerable restriction on their freedom. Many believed that the British Crown was more interested in appeasing savage tribes than rewarding the settlers who had fought and died for the British Empire. These sentiments helped fuel the growing revolutionary fervor in the colonies. It wasn't just taxes and tea that drove the American colonists to revolt. It was the belief that they were being denied their right to expand and conquer. The Proclamation of 1763 became another symbol of British oppression in the eyes of the colonists, a betrayal that would lead them down the path to war and independence. The American Revolution, a death knell for Native American sovereignty. When the dust of the American Revolution finally settled, it was clear that Native Americans had lost far more than just a war. The proclamation that had once protected their lands was now void. In the newly formed United States, there was no room for indigenous rights. The founders of the new nation were determined to expand westward, and they saw no place for Native Americans in this grand vision. New laws, like the Non-Intercourse Act, were passed, recognizing the special legal status of tribes but giving the U.S. government unprecedented power over their lands and affairs. These laws reflected a deeply paternalistic attitude towards Native Americans, viewing them as uncivilized and incapable of managing their own affairs. The government took on a supervisory role, controlling how land deals were made, ensuring that the tribes were slowly but surely pushed further west. The tragic march west, Indian removal and the end of sovereignty. By the early 19th century, the U.S. government had begun a campaign of systematic removal, pushing Native American tribes off their ancestral lands and into designated Indian Territory, west of the Mississippi River. This policy, known as Indian removal, was nothing short of ethnic cleansing. Entire tribes were forced to leave the lands they had inhabited for thousands of years, marching hundreds of miles under brutal conditions. Many died along the way, their bodies left to rot along the Trail of Tears, a stark reminder of the U.S. government's betrayal. Treaty after treaty was signed, each one taking more land from the tribes, each one pushing them further into the margins of American society. The once vast Indian Reserve established by the British in 1763 had been whittled down to nothing, replaced by a system of reservations that were little more than prisons for indigenous peoples. The legacy of betrayal, a history written in blood. The story of Native Americans during this period is one of hope, betrayal, resistance, and survival. The Proclamation of 1763, hailed at the time as a victory for indigenous rights, was ultimately a fleeting illusion. The forces of colonization, greed, and expansion were too powerful to be stopped by a single decree. The Native Americans who gathered at Fort Niagara in 1763 to celebrate their newfound rights could not have imagined the horrors that lay ahead: the wars, the forced removals, the broken treaties.